In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a jeweler lies dead, a dagger in his heart. His priceless sapphire, the star of Ceylon, stolen. Was it the ambitious apprentice, envious of his master's skill? The desperate wife, trapped by debts and dreams? The wealthy buyer, obsessed with possessing the gem? Or the loyal guard, whose vigilance failed at the fatal moment? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, can unravel the secrets hidden in this sleepy village. But as whispers of greed and betrayal surface, one truth shines clear: someone killed for more than a jewel. Can you spot the killer before she does? Chapter 1. The shattered displays. Village of St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the golden haze of a June afternoon, its thatched cottages and winding lanes exuding a deceptive tranquility. Roses spilled over garden walls, their scent mingling with the warmth of sun-baked stone. In her neat parlor at Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the open window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp despite their mild expression, flickered occasionally to the street below, where villagers went about their unhurried routines. It was a scene she knew intimately, each face and habit catalogued in her mind with the precision of a ledger. Her needles stilled as a faint disturbance reached her ears, murmur of voices, rising in pitch, followed by the hurried tread of boots. Peering out, she saw a small knot of villagers gathering outside Mr. Gideon Vale's jewelry shop, its gilded sign glinting faintly in the sunlight. Constable Hurst, his face flushed and his helmet slightly askew, was attempting to shoo the onlookers back with the air of a man unaccustomed to such excitement. Miss Marple's lips pursed. St. Mary Mead was no stranger to small scandals, petty thefts or quarrels over a straying cow, but this was different. The air held a sharper edge, a whisper of something darker. Setting her knitting aside, she adjusted her lace cap, retrieved her sturdy walking stick, and donned a light shawl. With measured steps, she made her way down the lane, her slight figure drawing curious glances from those who knew her knack for unraveling the village's secrets. As she approached the shop, the crowd parted respectfully, their whispers trailing off. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, her eyes wide with unease. "It's dreadful, isn't it?" Miss Marple offered a gentle nod, her gaze fixed on the shop's open door. "Dreadful indeed," she murmured, stepping inside. The interior was dim, the air heavy with the metallic temps of blood and the faint gleam of scattered gemstones. At the heart of the workshop, slumped over his polished oak workbench, lay Gideon Vale, the village jeweler. A dagger protruded from his chest, its ornate handle catching the light with an almost mocking elegance. Blood had pooled beneath him, staining the intricate engravings on the table's edge. Nearby, a display case stood violated, its glass shattered, and the velvet cushion within was conspicuously bare. The star of Ceylon, a sapphire of rare beauty and whispered value, was gone. Constable Hurst hovered nearby, his notebook trembling slightly in his hands. "Miss Marple," he said, relief flooding his voice, "I'm glad you're here. It's murder, plain as day. Found him just like this not an hour ago, after young Thomas Reed came running for help." His eyes darted to the body, then away. "Never seen anything like it in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind was already at work, sifting through the scene with the clarity of long practice. The workshop was a study in contrasts. Orderly shelves lined with tools and glittering stones stood untouched, yet the broken case and the dagger spoke of violence and haste. She noted the dagger's handle, inlaid with mother of pearl, an object too decorative for everyday use in a jeweler's trade. Curious, she thought, that it bore no smudges or prints either, wiped clean or handled with care. The shattered glass of the display case crunched underfoot as she stepped closer, observing the precise point of impact. The blow had come from outside the case, suggesting force, yet the rest of the shop remained undisturbed. A theft, certainly, but was it the motive, or a convenient mask? She turned to the constable. "When did this happen, Mr. Hurst?" Her voice was soft, but her eyes missed nothing. "Near as we can tell, around noon," he replied, consulting his notes. "Thomas, the apprentice, says he stepped out to fetch lunch at 11:30 and found Mr. Vale like this when he returned, just before 12. We've got 4 in the frame: Thomas Reed, Mrs. Margaret Vale, a buyer named Lawrence Crane, and Samuel Holt, the guard. All were seen about the shop this morning." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the suspects. Thomas, a young man, with ambition in his eyes. Margaret, the jeweler's wife, whose sharp voice was as well known as her husband's craft. Crane, a stranger with wealth and purpose. And Holt, the stoic guard whose duty was to prevent such tragedies. Each, she knew, would have a story, and within those stories lay the truth, tangled like threads in a poorly knit scarf. "May I see the workshop again tomorrow?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. "In the daylight, things often appear clearer." "Of course, Miss Marple," said Hurst, clearly grateful for her interest. "I'll keep the place locked tight." As she stepped back into the fading sunlight, the crowd's murmurs followed her. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already weaving a pattern from the fragments she had gathered: a dagger too fine for a workshop, a missing gem, and 4 souls whose secrets would soon come to light. St. Mary Mead might seem a sleepy village, but she knew better than most that even the quietest places held shadows deep enough to hide a killer. Chapter 2. The 4 suspects. The sun had dipped below the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobbled lane outside Gideon Vale's jewelry shop. The crowd had dispersed, leaving only a few curious stragglers, whispering theories, under the gaslight. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the shop's threshold, her small, neat figure framed against the darkening street. The air inside was heavy, the metallic scent of blood now mingling with the faint polish of wood and the glitter of scattered gemstones. Constable Hurst, still clutching his notebook, looked to her with the deference of a man out of his depth. Murder was not a common visitor to St. Mary Mead, and the constable's usual duties resolving disputes over market stalls or tracking. A wayward sheep had ill-prepared him for the grim tableau before them. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unclouded, despite her years, surveyed the workshop with quiet intensity. The body of Gideon Vale remained where it had fallen, slumped over his workbench, the dagger's ornate handle protruding from his chest like a grotesque ornament. The shattered display case, its glass strewn across the floor, gaped emptily where the star of Ceylon had once rested. She noted again the precision of the scene, the chaos confined to the case and the body. The rest of the shop untouched, its shelves of tools and trays of lesser gems undisturbed. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple had always been fond of puzzles, whether in the form of a tangled skein of wool or the darker intricacies of human nature. "Constable Hurst," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority, "perhaps you could tell me more about these 4 individuals you mentioned. Thomas Reed, Mrs. Vale, Mr. Crane, and Mr. Holt. Each was near the shop, you say?" Hurst nodded, flipping open his notebook with a nervous energy. "Yes, Miss Marple. All 4 were seen about the place this morning, around the time we reckon the murder happened near noon. The doctor says, based on, well, the state of things." He gestured vaguely toward the body, his face palling. "Thomas Reed, the apprentice, was in and out of the shop all morning. Says he went to fetch lunch at 11:30 and found Mr. Vale dead when he returned. Mrs. Margaret Vale was upstairs in their flat, or so she claims. Lawrence Crane, a buyer from London, was here earlier, haggling over that sapphire, and Samuel Holt, the guard, was at his post outside the door the whole time." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a gesture that might have been mistaken for disapproval but was, in truth, the outward sign of her mind at work. Motive and opportunity, she murmured, almost to herself. Those are the threads we must follow. A murder is never a simple thing, Constable, though it may wear a simple face. And the theft of the sapphire well, that adds its own knot to the pattern. She stepped closer to the workbench, careful not to disturb the scene. The dagger caught her eye again, its mother-of-pearl handle gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was no ordinary tool, not something a jeweler would use to pry open a setting or cut a wire. Its presence suggested intent, perhaps even premeditation. She leaned forward, noting the absence of fingerprints on the handle, either wiped clean or handled with gloves, a detail that spoke of calculation. The broken display case, too, was curious. The glass had shattered inward, as if struck with force from outside, yet the velvet cushion within was undisturbed, its folds smooth. A hurried theft or a deliberate staging? She filed the thought away, turning her attention to the constable. I should like to speak with each of them, she said. Not here, perhaps, but soon. In the meantime, might I examine the workshop more closely? There are small details that may tell us more than they seem to. Hurst nodded eagerly, relieved to have her guidance. Of course, Miss Marple, I'll have the place locked tight tonight, and you can come back tomorrow in the daylight. I'll make sure the suspects don't go far. Miss Marple inclined her head, her thoughts already turning to the four names. Thomas Reed, the apprentice, young and perhaps ambitious, learning a trade that promised wealth but demanded patience. Margaret Vale, the jeweler's wife, tied to her husband by vows but perhaps strained by the realities of life above a struggling shop. Lawrence Crane, a man of means, with an eye for rare gems, whose presence in St. Mary Mead was no coincidence. And Samuel Holt, the guard, whose duty was to protect, yet who had failed to prevent a murder at his post. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in their words alone, but in the spaces between what they did not say, what they could not hide. She stepped back into the evening air, the village settling into its quiet rhythms. The shop was sealed behind her, but the questions it held followed her home. At Danemead Cottage, she lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as her mind worked. The sapphire, the dagger, the broken glass, these were the facts, but facts were only the surface. Beneath them lay the currents of human desire, fear, and betrayal. She would begin with the suspects, drawing out their stories as carefully as she unraveled a knot in her wool the following morning. Miss Marple rose early, her routine undisturbed by the previous day's grim discovery. After a light breakfast of tea and toast, she made her way to the village hall, where Constable Hurst had arranged for the suspects to be questioned. The hall, usually reserved for parish meetings and the occasional dance, felt oddly formal, its wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle. Hurst stood at the front, his notebook at the ready, while a young sergeant from the county station hovered nearby, clearly skeptical of the elderly lady in the tweed skirt and laced cap. Miss Marple took her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes scanning the room. The suspects had not yet arrived, but she used the moment to consider what she knew. Gideon Vale had been a man of skill, his reputation extending beyond St. Mary Mead to the collectors of London and beyond. The star of Ceylon, a sapphire of deep blue fire, had been his pride, a gem that drew envy and desire. Its theft suggested greed, but the dagger in his chest spoke of something more personal: anger, perhaps, or desperation. The four suspects, each with their own connection to Vale, would hold the key, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust first impressions. People, like villages, wore masks. The door opened, and Thomas Reed entered first, his lanky frame slouched in an attempt at nonchalance. His cap was clutched tightly in his hands, and his eyes, though red-rimmed, held a wariness that Miss Marple noted at once. He took a seat, his gaze flickering between her and the constable. "Mr. Reed," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but precise. "You were in the shop all morning, I understand. Tell me about your day." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twisting the cap. "I was working with Mr. Vale, same as always. Polishing settings, sorting stones." He was in a mood, though kept muttering about the sapphire, how it was too good for most buyers. "Around 11:30, he sent me to the Red Lion for lunch. I was gone maybe 20 minutes. When I got back," he swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, "he was dead. The sapphire was gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. 20 minutes is not long," she said. "The Red Lion is close by. Did you see anyone near the shop when you left or returned?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers tightening on the cap. "No one unusual. Mr. Crane had been there earlier, but he was gone by then. Holt was at the door, like always. I didn't see Mrs. Vale." Miss Marple nodded, noting the boy's unease. His alibi was thin, the pub a mere 5-minute walk, and his manner suggested something unspoken. Was it fear of suspicion, or something deeper? She thanked him, her smile reassuring. But her thoughts were already turning to the next piece of the puzzle. Margaret Vale entered next, her posture rigid despite the traces of grief in her swollen eyes. She was a striking woman, her dark hair pinned tightly, her dress simple but well cut. She sat with the air of someone bracing for an ordeal, her handkerchief clutched like a talisman. "Mrs. Vale," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "This must be a terrible shock. Can you tell me where you were at the time of your husband's death?" Margaret's lips tightened briefly before she spoke. "I was upstairs in our flat, preparing lunch. I heard nothing, no shouts, no struggle. Gideon often worked with the door locked, especially when handling the sapphire. I came down just after noon, when Thomas started shouting." Her voice wavered, but her eyes held Miss Marple steadily. "And the sapphire," Miss Marple said, "it was important to your husband, I gather." Margaret's expression hardened. "Too important. He fussed over it like it was a child. Mr. Crane offered a fortune, £10,000, but Gideon wouldn't sell. He said it was his legacy." A trace of bitterness crept into her voice, quickly masked. "We could have used the money, but Gideon was stubborn." Miss Marple noted the unpaid bills she had glimpsed in the Vale's flat, the worn furniture that spoke of financial strain. Margaret's grief seemed genuine, but there was a tension beneath it, a suggestion of unspoken resentments. She thanked the widow, her mind cataloging the possibility of a wife driven to desperation by a husband's obsession. Lawrence Crane was next. His tailored suit and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the village's homely setting. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to wealth, but his eyes were restless, assessing Miss Marple as if gauging her threat. She met his gaze with her usual mildness, her hands folded serenely. "Mr. Crane," she began, "you came to St. Mary Mead for the Star of Ceylon, I understand. Tell me about your visit to the shop." Crane leaned back, his smile practiced. "I did. Vale had a gem unlike any other, a sapphire of perfect clarity. I offered £10,000, a fair price, but he refused. Said it wasn't for sale. I left the shop at 11, disappointed but not surprised. I was at the inn by past, having lunch." Miss Marple tilted her head. "A short walk to the inn, I believe. Did you notice anything unusual as you left? The guard, perhaps, or anyone near the shop?" Crane's smile didn't waver, but his fingers tapped briefly on his knee. Holt was at his post, as always. "I didn't see anyone else. The street was quiet." Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts lingering on his composure. A man like Crane, used to acquiring what he desired, might not take kindly to refusal. The inn's maid had confirmed his presence, but 2 minutes was enough for a determined man to act. She filed the thought away, her attention turning to the final suspect. Samuel Holt entered last, his burly frame filling the doorway. His face was weathered, his eyes steady but guarded. He sat heavily, his hands clasped. And Miss Marple noted the faint smudge of sawdust on his boot, sawdust like that in Vale's workshop. A small detail, but one that pricked her curiosity. "Mr. Holt," she said, "you were at your post all morning. I understand. Tell me what you saw." Holt's voice was gruff, but clear. "I stood outside the shop, as always. Saw Mr. Crane come and go, around 11. Thomas left for lunch at past. Came back in a panic just before 12. No one else went in or out. I'd have seen them." Miss Marple's eyes rested on his boots. "You never entered the shop yourself? Not even to check on Mr. Vale?" Holt's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am. My job's outside. Mr. Vale liked his privacy when he worked." She nodded, her mind noting the sawdust, the unwavering alibi, and the faint defensiveness in his tone. A guard who saw nothing, yet stood mere feet from a murder. It was possible, but it strained belief. She thanked him, her smile as gentle as ever, but her thoughts were racing. As the suspects left, Miss Marple remained in the hall, her mind weaving the threads together. Thomas, with his weak alibi and nervous glances. Margaret, with her grief and hidden bitterness. Crane, with his ambition and polished exterior. Holt, with his steady gaze and curious boots. Each had opportunity, each had motive, but the truth lay in the details: the dagger, the glass, the missing sapphire. She would return to the shop tomorrow, in the clear light of day, and see what secrets it might yield. For now, she rose, her steps light despite the weight of the mystery. St. Mary Mead might be a quiet village, but Miss Marple knew that even the quietest places held shadows deep enough to hide a killer's heart. Chapter 3. The Apprentice's Tale. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Dame Mead Cottage, casting delicate patterns across Miss Jane Marple's parlor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside, her knitting untouched. Her mind, however, was far from idle, turning over the events of the previous day with the precision of a watchmaker. The murder of Gideon Vale, the missing star of Ceylon, the ornate dagger-reach detail was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. The four suspects, Thomas Reed, Margaret Vale, Lawrence Crane, and Samuel Holt, had each offered their stories. But Miss Marple knew that truth often hid in the pauses, the glances, the things left unsaid. Today, she would begin to tug at those threads, starting with the youngest, and perhaps the most impressionable, Thomas Reed, the apprentice. She made her way to the village hall, where Constable Hurst had arranged for Thomas to meet her. The hall was quieter today, the initial shock of the murder giving way to a subdued unease that hung over St. Mary Mead like a mist. The constable greeted her with a nod, his face still etched with the strain of a case beyond his experience. "Thomas is waiting, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a small room off the main hall. "Nervous lad, but he's ready to talk." Miss Marple entered the room, her steps soft on the polished floor. Thomas Reed sat at a plain wooden table, his lanky frame hunched, his hands fidgeting with the frayed edge of his cap. He was a boy of 19, with the awkward limbs of youth not yet settled into manhood. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, though whether from grief, fear, or something else, Miss Marple could not yet determine. She took a seat opposite him, her expression one of kindly interest, calculated to put him at ease. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. "I hope you've managed some rest. This must be a dreadful time for you." Thomas's eyes flicked up, then down again. "Not much sleep, ma'am," he muttered. "Mr. Vale, he was good to me, taught me the trade, and now," his voice trailed off, his fingers tightening on the cap. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes, a terrible loss. I'd like you to tell me about yesterday morning, Thomas. Everything you can remember, no matter how small it seems. Sometimes the littlest things matter most. Thomas swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was in the shop from 8, like always. Mr. Vale was at his bench, working on a gold ring for Mrs. Langley. I was sorting stones, amethysts, mostly, for a necklace. He was quiet, but that wasn't unusual. He'd get like that when he was thinking about the Star of Ceylon. His voice faltered, and he glanced at the table, as if the mention of the sapphire conjured its absence. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. The sapphire was special to him, wasn't it? Did he often speak of it? Thomas nodded, his fingers still worrying the cap. All the time, ma'am. Called it his masterpiece. Said it was worth more than the whole shop. Mr. Crane was there that morning, wanting to buy it. They argued not loud, but sharp. Mr. Vale wouldn't budge. Said the sapphire wasn't for sale, no matter the price. And what time was this? Miss Marple asked, her tone unchanged, but her mind alert. About 10. Maybe a bit after. Mr. Crane left soon after, looking cross. I stayed till 11:30, when Mr. Vale sent me to the Red Lion for lunch. I got him his usual bread, cheese, a bit of cold meat. Took me maybe 15 minutes. When I got back, he stopped, his face paling further. He was lying there, the dagger in him, the sapphire gone. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her thoughts were racing. 15 minutes was a narrow window, yet long enough for a determined killer. The Red Lion was a short walk, as she had noted yesterday, and Thomas's absence left the shop, vulnerably or, perhaps conveniently so. "Did you lock the door when you left, Thomas?" she asked. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. Mr. Vale always kept it locked when he was working alone. I think I locked it, ma'am, but I was in a hurry. Can't swear to it." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the uncertainty. A locked door would point to someone with access, a key, perhaps, or a means of entry known only to those close to Vale. And Mr. Holt, the guard, was he at his post when you left? "Yes, ma'am, standing right outside, like always." He nodded to me as I went by. Thomas's voice was steadier now, but his hands betrayed him. Twisting the cap until the fabric frayed, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to his hands, noting the faint calluses from his work with tools and stones. They were the hands of an apprentice, skilled but not yet masterful, marked by hours. At the bench, she thought of the dagger, its ornate handle free of prints, and wondered if Thomas's hands, gloved or careful, could have wielded it. "You admired Mr. Vale, didn't you?" she said, her tone conversational. "It must have been a privilege to learn from such a craftsman." Thomas's face softened, a flicker of pride breaking through his unease. "He was the best, ma'am. Could cut a stone so it sank. I wanted to be like him someday, but he was hard, too. Didn't let me touch the good stones, not even the sapphire. Said I wasn't ready." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "That must have been frustrating, Thomas, to be so close to such beauty, yet kept at a distance." The boy flushed, his fingers stilling for a moment. "I suppose, but I understood. The sapphire was special. Everyone wanted it." His voice held a note of resentment, quickly masked, but Miss Marple caught it, like a false stitch in a pattern. She shifted tack, her tone as mild as ever. "Tell me about the dagger, Thomas. Had you seen it before? It's an unusual piece for a workshop." Thomas frowned, his brow creasing. I think so, ma'am. Mr. Vale had a drawer where he kept odd things, old tools, bits of jewelry he'd bought at auctions. The dagger might have been there. I never paid it much mind." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the vagueness of his answer. A drawer of curios, accessible to an apprentice, yet the dagger's use suggested intent. She thought of the broken display case, the glass shattered inward, the velvet cushion undisturbed, and the sapphire, she said, When did you last see it? Yesterday morning, before Mr. Crane came. Mr. Vale took it out to show him, then locked it back in the case. He was particular about it, always locked the case himself. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. A locked case, a missing key, a dagger from a private drawer. These were not the work of an outsider, but of someone who knew Vale's habits. Thomas, as his apprentice, would have observed those habits daily. But did he have the nerve for murder? She recalled a boy in her own village, years ago, who had stolen from his employer out of envy, his hands trembling as he confessed. Thomas's hands trembled now, but whether from guilt or fear, she could not yet say thank you. Thomas, she said, rising with a grace that belied her years, you've been very helpful. If anything else comes to mind, you'll tell Constable Hurst, won't you? He nodded, his eyes avoiding hers as he stood, cap still clutched tightly. As he left, Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his words and manner. The boy was nervous, his alibi weak, his resentment palpable. Yet murder required a certain boldness, a hardness she wasn't sure Thomas possessed. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories of young men driven to desperate acts by ambition or envy, and wondered if Thomas's admiration for Vale had curdled into something darker. She turned to Constable Hurst, who had been listening quietly. A good lad, perhaps, she said, but young men can be impulsive. We must see what the others say. Mrs. Vale, I think, should be next. Hurst nodded, scribbling in his notebook. I'll fetch her, Miss Marple, and thank you. I don't know how you do it, but you've a way of seeing things. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts already turning to Margaret Vale. The apprentice had given her a glimpse of the shop's inner workings, but the wife would know the man behind the craftsman. As she waited, she pictured the workshop again, the dagger, the glass, the empty cushion. Thomas's story fit, but it was too neat, too rehearsed. The truth, she knew, was rarely so tidy. It lay in the shadows, waiting for her to shine a light upon it. Chapter 4. The wife's grief. The village hall of St. Mary Mead stood hushed in the late morning light, its high windows admitting shafts of sunlight that danced across the worn wooden floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her chair, her posture straight, but unassuming, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The air carried a faint scent of polish and dust, a reminder of the hall's usual role in parish meetings and festive gatherings. Today, however, it served a graver purpose. Constable Hurst hovered near the door, his notebook open, his expression one of quiet reliance on the elderly lady, whose sharp mind had already begun to unravel the threads of Gideon Vale's murder. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on her conversation with Thomas Reed, the apprentice. His nervous manner, his vague recollection of the dagger, and his thin alibi had painted a picture of a young man caught in a web of circumstance or, perhaps, of his own making. Now, she turned her attention to Margaret Vale, the jeweler's widow, whose grief might conceal more than it revealed. Miss Marple knew well that a wife's heart could hold both love and resentment, and the Vale's modest life above the shop suggested strains that might have frayed those bonds. The door opened, and Margaret Vale entered, her steps measured but heavy, as if each carried the weight of her loss. She was a woman in her mid-40s, handsome rather than beautiful, with dark hair pinned tightly and a face marked by recent tears. Her dress, though simple, was meticulously pressed, a sign of pride, or perhaps a shield against scrutiny. She sat across from Miss Marple, her hands clutching a lace handkerchief, her eyes meeting the older woman's with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. "Good morning, Mrs. Vale," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and warm, like a neighbor, offering condolences over tea. "I'm so very sorry for your loss. It must be a terrible shock, losing Mr. Vale so suddenly." Margaret's lips tightened, and she nodded, dabbing at her eyes with the handkerchief. "It is, Miss Marple. Gideon was everything to me. We had our life together, our plans. And now? Her voice broke, but her gaze held steady, as if daring Miss Marple to doubt her sorrow. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of gentle sympathy. Of course, it's a dreadful thing. I wonder if you might help me understand what happened yesterday. You were upstairs in your flat, I believe, when it occurred. Margaret straightened, her hands smoothing the handkerchief in her lap. Yes, I was. I was preparing lunch. Gideon liked a simple meal at noon, bread and soup. Nothing fancy. I heard nothing out of the ordinary. The shop door was locked, as it always was when he worked alone. I came down just after 12, when I heard Thomas shouting. Her voice was calm, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the faint tremor in Margaret's fingers. The staircase from your flat leads directly to the shop, doesn't it? It's quite visible from the street, I understand. Yes, Margaret said quickly. Anyone passing would have seen me if I'd gone down, but I didn't. I was upstairs, until Thomas's cries brought me running. Her tone was firm, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's mind registered the careful choice of words. And the sapphire, the star of Ceylon, Miss Marple continued, her tone as light as if discussing a neighbor's garden. It was very dear to your husband, wasn't it? I imagine it occupied much of his time. Margaret's expression darkened, a shadow passing over her face. Too dear, she said, her voice low. Gideon loved that stone more than anything. He'd sit for hours, polishing it, turning it in the light. He said it was his legacy, a gem that would make his name. Mr. Crane offered £10,000 for it, a fortune, but Gideon refused. He said no price was enough. Her lips twisted slightly, a flicker of bitterness that vanished as quickly. As it appeared, Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. £10,000 is a great deal of money, she said. It must have been tempting, especially with the shop's expenses. I couldn't help but notice, when I passed by your flat, that things seemed a little strained. Margaret's hands stilled, and her eyes narrowed briefly before she composed herself. We managed, she said curtly. Gideon's work was steady, even if the sapphire took up too much of his time. We didn't need to sell it. He had his pride. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the worn furniture and unpaid bills she had glimpsed in the Vale's flat. Pride was a fine thing, but it did not pay debts. She recalled a woman in her village, years ago, whose husband's obsession with a failing business had driven her to quiet desperation. Margaret's composure was admirable, but beneath it lay something taut, like a string stretched near breaking. Tell me about the dagger, Miss Marple said, shifting tack. It's an unusual piece, not something one expects in a jeweler's workshop. Had you seen it before? Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. I believe so. Gideon collected odd things, old tools, trinkets from estate sales. He kept them in a locked drawer in his workbench. The dagger might have been part of that collection. I didn't pay much attention to it. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her, noting the slight falter in her voice. A locked drawer, accessible to a wife who shared the shop space, who might know where keys were kept. And the display case, she said, where the sapphire was kept. Was it always locked? Always, Margaret said firmly. Gideon was particular about it. He had the only key, kept it on a chain in his pocket. No one else could open that case. Miss Marple's mind turned to the shattered glass, the inward break suggesting a blow from outside. If the case was locked, the key in Vale's pocket, why break the glass? A thief in a hurry, or a deliberate act to suggest theft. She thought of the undisturbed velvet cushion, the sapphire's absence, too neat, too staged. You and Mr. Vale were close, I'm sure, she said gently. Did he ever mention any worries? Anyone who might have wished him harm? Margaret shook her head, her eyes glistening. No one. Gideon was respected, admired even. His work was his life. He had no enemies. Her voice wavered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. I can't imagine who would do this. Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly on Margaret's arm. Of course, my dear. It's a terrible mystery, but we'll find the truth, I promise you. Her tone was comforting, but her eyes were keen, noting the widow's rigid posture, the quick recovery from her tears. Grief was there, yes, but so was something else, anger, perhaps, or fear, as Margaret rose to leave. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloging the details. The wife's alibi was strong, supported by the visibility of the staircase. Yet, her bitterness about the sapphire and the couple's financial strain suggested a motive. The dagger, from a locked drawer, pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of Vale's habits. Margaret, as his wife, would have such knowledge, but would she wield a dagger in anger? Miss Marple thought of a neighbor long ago, whose quiet resentment had simmered until it spilled over in a moment of passion. Margaret's grief seemed genuine, but grief could mask darker truths. She turned to Constable Hurst, who had been listening quietly. A sad case, Constable, she said, her voice thoughtful. Mrs. Vale is suffering, but there's more to her story, I think. I'd like to speak with Mr. Crane next. A man who travels for a gem may have much to tell us. Hurst nodded, jotting in his notebook. I'll send for him, Miss Marple. You've a way of getting to the heart of things. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts already turning to Lawrence Crane. The widow had given her a glimpse into the jeweler's life, but the buyer would offer a different perspective, one of ambition and desire. As she waited, she pictured the workshop again, the dagger's gleam, the broken glass, the empty cushion. Margaret's story, like Thomas's, fit the facts, but it left gaps, shadows where the truth might hide. Miss Marple knew that truth was like a garden weed, hidden, but always there if one knew where to look. Chapter 5. The Buyer's Ambition. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its high-beamed ceiling and faint scent of wax polish, felt almost too grand for the grim task at hand. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair, her posture as unassuming as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The morning light had given way to the softer glow of midday, streaming through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the floor. Constable Hurst stood near the door, his notebook worn from constant use, his expression one of quiet trust in the elderly lady whose gentle demeanor belied a mind as sharp as a jeweler's loop. The interviews with Thomas Reed and Margaret Vale had yielded threads of truth, nervousness from the apprentice, restrained bitterness from the widow, but the tapestry of Gideon Vale's murder remained incomplete. Now, Miss Marple turned her attention to Lawrence Crane, the wealthy buyer whose pursuit of the Star of Ceylon had brought him to this quiet village. The door opened, and Crane entered with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. His face was handsome in a calculated way, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that assessed the room with a predator's calm. He took a seat across from Miss Marple, his smile polished but not entirely warm, as if gauging how much this frail-looking woman might trouble his plans. "Good day, Mr. Crane," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and pleasant, as if inviting him to tea, rather than questioning him about a murder. "It's kind of you to come. I understand you traveled to St. Mary Mead for a very particular purpose, the Star of Ceylon." Crane's smile tightened slightly, but he nodded, leaning back in his chair with an air of ease. "Indeed, Miss Marple, I'm a collector of fine gems, and Vale's sapphire was exceptional, a deep blue, flawless clarity, cut to perfection. I came to acquire it, nothing more." His voice was smooth, practiced, but Miss Marple noted the faint tension in his jaw, the way his fingers brushed the cuff of his sleeve. She tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "It must be quite a passion, collecting such treasures." Tell me about your visit to the shop yesterday. I believe you were there in the morning. Crane's eyes met hers, steady but guarded. I was. I arrived around 10, hoping to convince Vale to sell. I offered £10,000, a generous sum, more than fair. He refused, as he had before. Said the sapphire was his legacy, not for sale, at any price. We spoke for perhaps half an hour, then I left, around 11. I was at the Black Swan, in by past, having lunch. His tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight pause before he mentioned the inn, as if ensuring his story aligned. The Black Swan is close by, isn't it? She said, her tone as light as ever. A 2-minute walk, perhaps. Did you notice anything as you left the shop? Mr. Holt, the guard, for instance, or anyone else lingering nearby? Crane's fingers stilled on his cuff, and he leaned forward slightly, his smile unwavering. Holt was at his post, standing like a statue outside the door. I didn't see anyone else. The street was quiet, typical for a village like this. He spread his hands, as if to say the matter was simple, but Miss Marple noted the calculated ease of the gesture, like a man playing a role. She nodded, her thoughts turning to the timeline. 11 to 11:30, a narrow window, but enough for a determined man to act, especially one familiar with the shop's layout. The inn's maid had confirmed Crane's presence at lunch, but 2 minutes was time enough to return, to strike, to take. She recalled a gentleman in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose charm had masked a ruthless streak, his smile disarming until the moment he betrayed a friend. Crane's polish reminded her of that man, and she wondered what lay beneath it. The sapphire must have been a great temptation, she said, her voice gentle but probing. A collector's dream, you called it. It's curious, isn't it, that it vanished just after your visit? Crane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker Miss Marple caught like a moth in a net. Curious, perhaps, he said, recovering smoothly, but I had no part in it. I deal in gems through legitimate means, Miss Marple. I don't resort to theft or worse. His tone was firm, but there was a defensive edge, a hint of indignation. That suggested her question had struck a nerve. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. I only meant that such a gem would attract attention, perhaps from others less scrupulous. Tell me, had you seen the dagger before, the one found in poor Mr. Vale's chest? It's an unusual piece, not a tool one would expect in a workshop. Crane's brow creased, and he shook his head. Never saw it. I'm no expert in weapons, only gems. Vale kept his tools and trinkets in a drawer, I believe, but I never looked closely. My interest was in the sapphire, nothing else. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the quick glance he cast toward the constable, as if ensuring his words were heard. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with interest. And the display case, where the sapphire was kept, did you see Mr. Vale lock it after showing you the stone? Crane nodded, his composure intact. He did. Took a key from his pocket, locked the case, and put the key back. He was meticulous about it. No one could have opened that case without breaking, or taking the key. His words were confident, but Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail. A key in Vale's pocket, yet the case shattered. Why break the glass if the key was accessible? Unless the breakage was meant to mislead. She thought of the workshop, the glass strewn inward, the velvet cushion undisturbed. A thief in haste might smash a case, but a careful man, a man like Crane, with his polished manners and sharp eyes, might stage such a scene to obscure his actions. She recalled the gossip she had overheard at the bakery, whispers of Crane's lavish spending at the inn, hints of debts in London. A man in need of funds might see a sapphire as salvation, but would he kill for it? You've been most helpful, Mr. Crane, she said, her tone as warm as if thanking a guest for a pleasant visit. It's a puzzle, isn't it? A locked case. A missing gem, a dagger from nowhere. But puzzles do have solutions, if one looks closely enough. Crane's smile returned, though it was thinner now, less certain. I'm sure you'll find the truth, Miss Marple, he said, rising with a slight bow. If there's anything more I can do, you have only to ask. As he left, Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloguing his words and manner. His alibi was strong, supported by the ends made. But his ambition for the sapphire was clear, his composure too perfect. She thought of a collector she had known in her youth, whose obsession with rare books had driven him to deceit, his charm a mask for desperation. Crane's interest in the sapphire was more than professional, it was personal, almost reverent. But was it enough to push him to murder? She turned to Constable Hurst, who had been scribbling notes. A very polished gentleman, she said, her voice thoughtful. But polish can hide many things, Constable. I think Mr. Holt, the guard, should be next. His post outside the shop must have given him a clear view of who came and went. Hurst nodded, his face brightening at her direction. I'll fetch him, Miss Marple. You're getting somewhere, I can tell. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts already turning to Samuel Holt. Crane's story, like those of Thomas and Margaret, fit the facts, but it left shadows, gaps, where the truth might hide. The dagger, the glass, the sapphire's absence, these were the pieces, and she was beginning to see their shape. As she waited, she pictured the workshop again, its order disrupted by a single act of violence. Crane's ambition was a thread, but it was not yet the whole pattern. The truth, she knew, was like a rare gem itself, hidden, but waiting to be uncovered by a patient hand. Chapter 6. The Guard's Duty. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its sturdy beams and faint air of communal gatherings, seemed to hold its breath as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair, her small, neat figure a study in quiet attentiveness. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, her knitting untouched back at Danemead Cottage. For her mind was far too occupied with the puzzle of Gideon Vale's murder. The interviews with Thomas Reed, Margaret Vale, and Lawrence Crane had each added threads to the tapestry. Nervousness, bitterness, ambition, but the pattern remained elusive. Now, she turned her attention to Samuel Holt, the guard whose duty was to protect the jeweler's shop, yet who had stood mere feet from a murder and a theft. His story, she knew, would either clarify the picture or deepen its shadows. Constable Hurst stood by the door, his notebook worn from constant scribbling, his face marked by a mixture of deference and curiosity. He had come to rely on Miss Marple, gentle probing, her ability to see what others missed, and he opened the door to admit Samuel Holt with a nod. Here's Holt, Miss Marple, he said, stepping back. He's ready to answer your questions. Holt entered, his burly frame filling the doorway. He was a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a face that spoke of years spent outdoors, perhaps as a soldier or laborer, before taking up his post as Vale's guard. His dark coat was neatly pressed, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the faint smudge of sawdust on his boots, a detail she had noted yesterday, like the fine dust that coated the floor of Vale's workshop. He sat heavily, his hands clasped on the table, his eyes steady but guarded, as if bracing for scrutiny. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt, Miss Marple said, her voice as warm and unassuming as if she were greeting a neighbor at church. It's good of you to come. Your role at the shop must have been a great responsibility, guarding such treasures as the Star of Ceylon. Holt nodded, his jaw tight. It was, ma'am. Mr. Vale trusted me to keep his shop safe. I stood outside every day, watching the door, making sure no one got in who shouldn't. His voice was gruff, but clear, with the cadence of a man used to giving straightforward reports. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. And yesterday morning, you were at your post as usual. Tell me what you saw, Mr. Holt, from the moment the shop opened until poor Thomas raised the alarm. Holt's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. I was there from 8, when Mr. Vale opened up. Thomas was already inside, working. Mr. Crane came about 10, stayed maybe half an hour, then left, looking put out. Thomas went to the Red Lion at 11:30, like he often did for Mr. Vale's lunch. He was back by noon, shouting that Mr. Vale was dead. I ran in, saw the body, the broken case, and sent for the constable. His account was precise, almost mechanical. But Miss Marple noted the absence of any mention of himself entering the shop before the alarm. "You never stepped inside during that time?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Not even to speak with Mr. Vale, or check on the shop?" Holt's eyes met hers, steady but unyielding. "No, ma'am. My post is outside. Mr. Vale didn't like interruptions when he was working. I stayed by the door, where I could see everyone coming and going." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple's gaze drifted to his boots again, the sawdust a silent contradiction to his claim. She nodded, her thoughts turning to the workshop's layout. The door was visible from the street, Holt's post just outside, yet a murder had occurred within. The sapphire stolen, the case shattered. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice as light as a summer breeze, "that such a thing could happen with a guard so near. You saw no one else approach the shop, no strangers, no passers-by?" Holt shook his head, his expression unchanging. "No one, ma'am. The street was quiet. A few villagers walked by Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, and old Mr. Ellis, but no one went near the door. I'd have noticed." His tone was confident, but Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker in his eyes, a momentary unease that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded. "The sapphire, Mr. Holt, Mr. Vale must have spoken of it often. It was quite a treasure, I understand." Holt's jaw tightened again, and he nodded. "He did. Called it the Star of Ceylon. Said it was worth more than his whole shop. I never saw it up close. My job was to guard the door, not the stones, but I knew it was special. Mr. Crane was after it, kept coming back to haggle." His voice held a trace of disdain, as if he disapproved of Crane's persistence. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "And the dagger," she said, shifting tack. "The one found in Mr. Vale's chest. Had you ever seen it before? It's an unusual piece, not a tool one would expect in a jeweler's trade." Holt frowned, his hands shifting slightly on the table. "Can't say I had, ma'am. Mr. Vale had a drawer full of odd bits, old jewelry, tools, things he'd picked up at sales. Might have been in there, but I never looked closely. My eyes were on the street." His answer was quick, almost too quick, and Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders, as if the question had caught him off guard. She thought of the dagger, its mother-of-pearl handle gleaming in the workshop's dim light, its surface free of prints. A guard stationed outside would have little reason to handle such an object. Yet the sawdust on Holt's boots suggested he had been inside the shop, perhaps more than he admitted. She recalled a groundskeeper from her youth, a man whose loyalty to his employer had masked a small theft, his rough hands betraying him with traces of soil. Holt's boots were a similar clue, a whisper of truth beneath his steady words. "You must feel a great weight, Mr. Holt," she said, her tone sympathetic. "To have been so close, yet unable to prevent such a tragedy. It's a heavy burden for any man." Holt's eyes flickered, and for a moment, his guard seemed to drop. "It is, ma'am," he said quietly. "I keep thinking I should have heard something, seen something. But it happened so fast, and I was right there." His voice held a note of frustration, perhaps regret, but Miss Marple wondered if it was for a failure of duty or something else. She smiled gently, her mind cataloging his words and manner. "You've been very helpful, Mr. Holt. These things are never simple, but every detail helps. If anything else comes to mind, You'll tell Constable Hurst, won't you? Holt nodded, rising with a slight stiffness. I will, ma'am. I want this solved as much as anyone. He turned to leave, his heavy steps echoing in the quiet hall. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts racing. Holt's alibi was the strongest station. Outside, seen by villagers, his presence a constant. Yet the sawdust on his boots, the dagger's origin, the undisturbed shop, save for the broken cases, were inconsistencies that tugged at her mind. She thought of a watchman in a neighboring village, years ago, whose loyalty had been bought for a small sum. His vigilance a facade. Holt's duty was clear, but was his heart? A guard who saw nothing, yet stood so near a murder, was either negligent or complicit. She turned to Constable Hurst, who had been listening intently. A steady man, Mr. Holt, she said, her voice thoughtful. But steadiness can hide much, Constable. I think I should like to visit the shop again, in the daylight. There's small things that may tell us more. Hurst nodded, his face brightening. I'll arrange it, Miss Marple. You've a knack for this, I'll say that. He hesitated, then added, Do you think Holt's hiding something? Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost wistful. Everyone hides something, Constable, even if it's only from themselves. The trick is finding what matters. As Hurst left to summon the sergeant to unlock the shop, Miss Marple sat back, her mind turning over the guard's story. Holt's account was solid, his manner resolute, but the sawdust, the dagger, the sapphire's absence, these were cracks in the facade. She pictured the workshop again, the shattered glass, the velvet cushion untouched, the dagger's gleam. Holt's duty placed him at the heart of the mystery, yet he claimed to have seen nothing. The truth, she knew, was like a shadow in the sunlight, elusive, but present if one looked from the right angle. She would find that angle, in time. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow that softened the edges of its thatched cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple walked slowly along the high street, her sturdy shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones, her lace cap tilted just so against the breeze. To any passer-by, she was merely an elderly lady out for a stroll, perhaps to post a letter or visit the grocer. But her keen eyes missed nothing: the flutter of curtains as neighbors peered out, the hushed tones of gossip drifting from the bakery, the quick glances of villagers who knew a murder had shaken their quiet world. Miss Marple had always found that villages, like people, held their secrets close, but they whispered them to those who knew how to listen. Her interviews with Thomas Reed, Margaret Vale, Lawrence Crane, and Samuel Holt had given her much to ponder. Each suspect had offered a story that fit the facts, yet each left gaps: nervousness, bitterness, ambition, or steadfast denial that suggested more than was said. The dagger, the shattered display case, the missing star of Ceylon, these were the pieces of the puzzle, but the truth lay in the human heart, and St. Mary Mead's heart was beating with rumors. Miss Marple decided to spend the afternoon gathering those whispers, for she knew that gossip, like a skein of wool, often held knots of truth if one tugged gently enough. She began at the bakery, where Mrs. Price, a plump woman with flour-dusted hands and a penchant for talk, was arranging a tray of scones. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, and Mrs. Price looked up with a mixture of delight and eagerness, sensing an opportunity to share her thoughts on the village's tragedy. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as the freshly baked bread on the counter. "I thought I might take a few of your excellent scones for tea. It's been a trying few days, hasn't it?" Mrs. Price's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the empty shop. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. Poor Mr. Vale, stabbed like that in his own shop, and that sapphire gone. I saw him only last week, showing off. That stone, to anyone who'd look proud as anything, he was." She shook her head, her hands busy wrapping the scones in paper. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. A terrible loss. I understand Mrs. Vale is quite overcome. They were a devoted couple, I suppose. Mrs. Price's lips pursed, and she glanced toward the door before speaking. Devoted. Well, I suppose so, in their way. But they had their Rose. You know, I heard them myself, passing by the shop one evening. Margaret was on about money, said they could live comfortably if he'd sell that sapphire. Gideon snapped back, called it his legacy. She wasn't pleased, I can tell you. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. And those bills, piling up, Mrs. Ellis at the grocer's says they owed her for months. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert, filing away the hint of financial strain. Money troubles can weigh heavily, she said. Did you ever hear them speak of anyone else? Mr. Crane, perhaps, or young Thomas? Mrs. Price's face lit up, eager to share more. That Mr. Crane, such a fancy gentleman, came into the village like he owned it, throwing money about at the Black Swan. But Mr. Ellis heard from a cousin in London that Crane's not as rich as he seems. Debts, they say, and plenty of them. He was mad for that sapphire, came by the shop 3 times last week, always asking to see it. She paused, then added, as for Thomas, he's a quiet lad, but I've seen him watching Mr. Vale work, like he wished he could do half as well. Envious, maybe, but I can't see him killing anyone. Miss Marple thanked her, tucking the scones into her basket and stepping back into the street. The baker's words confirmed what she had glimpsed in the Vale's flattened paid bills, a marriage strained by a husband's obsession. Crane's debts were a new thread, one that suggested desperation beneath his polished exterior. Thomas's envy, too, was worth noting. Though Mrs. Price's dismissal of his capacity for murder echoed Miss Marple's own doubts, she thought of a young gardener she had known, whose jealousy of his master's roses had led to petty sabotage, not violence. Was Thomas cut from similar cloth, or did a darker impulse lurk within him? Her next stop was the grocer's, where Mr. Ellis, a wiry man with a ledger always at hand, was stacking tins behind the counter. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his face somber, but his eyes bright with the village's shared curiosity. Good day, Mr. Ellis, Miss Marple said, selecting a tin of biscuits with deliberate care. It's a sad business about Mr. Vale, isn't it? I suppose you saw him often, living so close to the shop. Mr. Ellis sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. Sad indeed, Miss Marple. Gideon was a good customer, though he hadn't paid his bill in a while. Always promised to settle up once he sold a big piece, but that sapphire of his he wouldn't part with it. Said it was worth more than gold. He shook his head, then leaned closer. That Mr. Crane was after it, you know. Came by the shop, often, always with a fat wallet, but I heard he's in deep with some London moneylenders. Thinks he's clever, but he's not fooling everyone. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind noting the repetition of Crane's debts. A man with debts might be tempted by a gem like that, she said. Did you ever see him act strangely near the shop? Mr. Ellis frowned, thinking. Not strange, exactly, but he lingered once or twice, watching the place from across the street. I thought he was just waiting for Vale to change his mind. As for Holt, the guard, he's a solid sort, always at his post, never a word out of place, though he hesitated, then lowered his voice. I saw him at the Red Lion one evening, drinking more than a guard ought. Made me wonder if he was as steady as he seems. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Holt's sawdust-smudged boots. A guard who drank too much might be careless, or worse, persuadable. She recalled a village constable from years ago, whose fondness for ale had led to a barn theft overlooked. And young Thomas? She asked. He's been with Mr. Vale for some time, hasn't he? 2 years, Mr. Ellis said. Quiet lad, keeps to himself. I heard him once, talking to a friend at the pub. saying how Vale never let him work on the good stones. Sounded sore about it, but who wouldn't be? Learning a trade's hard, when your master's so particular. Miss Marple thanked him, adding the biscuits to her basket and stepping back into the sunlight. The grocer's words added depth to her picture of the suspects. Margaret's financial woes, Crane's debts, Thomas's frustration, Holt's possible lapse in vigilance. Each was a thread, but none yet formed the whole pattern, she thought. Of the workshop, the daggers, clean handle, the shattered glass, the undisturbed cushion. The village's whispers were like a breeze, stirring the surface but not revealing the depths. Her final stop was the post office, where Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a sharp tongue and sharper ears, was sorting letters. She greeted Miss Marple with a brisk nod, her eyes gleaming with the chance to discuss the village's scandal. "Miss Marple, I knew you'd be about." Sniffing out the truth, Miss Hartnell said, pushing a stack of envelopes aside. "It's a shocking thing, Gideon. Vale murdered like that. I always said that Sapphire would bring trouble. Too much beauty draws the wrong sort." Miss Marple smiled faintly, selecting a few stamps. "It does seem to have drawn attention. I understand Mr. Crane was quite taken with it." Miss Hartnell snorted. "Taken? Obsessed? More like, I saw him myself, standing outside the shop last week, staring at that display case like a man bewitched. If you ask me, he's the sort who'd do anything to get what he wants. Not that I'm accusing anyone," she added hastily, though her tone suggested otherwise. "And Mrs. Vale?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. "She must be heartbroken." Miss Hartnell's eyes narrowed. "Heartbroken? Yes, but she's a proud one. I heard her at the market, complaining to Mrs. Langley about Gideon's stubbornness over that stone. Said it could have set them up for life, but he wouldn't listen. And Holt, well, he's dependable, but I've seen him slip into the red lion more than once. A guard should be sharper, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the repetition of Holt's drinking, Crane's fixation, Margaret's resentment. Thomas, too, appeared in the village's narrative as a frustrated youth, his ambition curbed by his master's exacting standards. She thought of a seamstress she had known, whose envy of her employer's skill had led to small acts of spite, not murder. But murder was not impossible, given the right pressure. As she left the post office, her basket heavier with scones, biscuits, and stamps, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's whispers. Each suspect had a motive. Thomas, ambition stifled. Margaret, financial desperation. Crane, a collector's obsession. Holt, perhaps negligence or something darker. The dagger and the missing sapphire were the keys, but the village's gossip had added color to the canvas. She would return to the shop tomorrow to examine it in the clear light of day, but for now, she walked home, her mind sifting through the rumors like a gardener tending her beds. At Danemead Cottage. She set her basket down and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The village had spoken, and its words had confirmed much of what she suspected. But the truth, she knew, was like a shadow in a storm fleeting, but there for those who looked closely. She would look closer, and soon. Chapter 8. The Dagger's Origin. The morning light crept over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, casting a soft glow on the dukest cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table in Danemead Cottage, a cup of tea steaming gently before her knitting set aside, as her mind wove through the threads of Gideon Vale's murder. The village's whispers, gathered yesterday at the bakery, grocers, and post office, had painted a vivid picture. Thomas Reed's quiet ambition, Margaret Vale's financial frustrations, Lawrence Crane's obsession with the Star of Ceylon, and Samuel Holt's possible lapses in vigilance. Yet the heart of the mystery lay in the workshop, the dagger, with its mother-of pearl handle, the shattered display case, the missing sapphire. These were not mere objects, but clues, each with a story to tell, and Miss Marple was determined to hear them. She rose, donning her tweed coat and lace cap, and made her way to the jeweler's shop. where Constable Hurst had promised to meet her. The village was stirring, its routines resuming despite the shadow of murder, but Miss Marple's steps were purposeful. The dagger, in particular, preoccupied her thoughts. Its ornate design was out of place in a craftsman's workshop, and its clean handle suggested a careful hand. She recalled a theft in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a decorative letter opener had betrayed the culprit, its origin tracing back to a specific drawer. The dagger, she suspected, held a similar secret. Constable Hurst was waiting outside the shop, his face brightening at her approach. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, unlocking the door. "I've kept the place just as it was, per your request. The sergeant's coming later to take more photographs, but you've got the run of it for now." "Thank you, Constable," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the morning breeze. "It's the small things, you know, that often speak loudest. I'd like to take a closer look at the workbench and that display case." The shop's interior was dim, the shutters still closed, but Hurst lit a lamp, casting a warm glow over the scene. Gideon Vale's body had been removed, but the bloodstains remained, a dark blot on the polished oak workbench. The shattered display case stood to one side, its glass fragments glinting like scattered stars. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a needle through fabric. The shelves of tools and trays of lesser gems were untouched, their order a stark contrast to the violence that had unfolded. She approached the workbench, her gaze drawn to the drawer Thomas had mentioned, a locked compartment where Vale kept his curios. "Constable," she said, "have you found the key to this drawer?" Mrs. Vale mentioned it was locked, and only her husband had access. Hurst nodded, producing a small brass key from an evidence bag. "Found it in Vale's pocket, just as she said. Haven't opened the drawer yet, thought it best to wait for you." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. "Very wise, Constable. Let's see what Mr. Vale kept hidden." Hurst unlocked the drawer, which slid open with a faint creak. Inside was a collection of odds and ends, a tarnished silver watch, a chipped cameo, a bundle of old receipts, and a small velvet pouch containing a few uncut stones. But no dagger. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes noting the drawer's tidy arrangement, the absence of dust suggesting frequent use. "Curious," she murmured. Thomas thought the dagger might have come from here, and Mrs. Vale was certain it was part of her husband's collection. Yet it's not here now. Hurst frowned, peering into the drawer. Could the killer have taken it from here, then? Before? You know? "Possibly," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "But a locked drawer suggests someone with access to the key or knowledge of where it was kept. Mr. Vale carried it on him, didn't he?" Hurst nodded. "Always, according to Mrs. Vale, on a chain in his pocket." Miss Marple's mind turned to the suspects. Thomas, as the apprentice, worked closely with Vale and might have seen where the key was kept. Margaret, as his wife, would know his habits intimately. Crane, a frequent visitor, could have observed Vale's routines, though his access was less certain. Holt, stationed outside, seemed the least likely. Yet the sawdust on his boots suggested he had been inside the shop at some point. She filed the thought away, turning her attention to the display case. The case was a sturdy affair, its wooden frame unmarred, save for the shattered glass front. The velvet cushion inside, where the Star of Ceylon had rested, was pristine, its folds undisturbed. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes narrowing. "The glass was struck from the outside," she said, pointing to the inward jagged edges. "A forceful blow, yet the cushion is untouched. A thief in a hurry would likely disturb the setting, wouldn't they?" Hurst scratched his head. "You'd think so, Miss Marple. Looks like they grabbed the sapphire and ran. Or wanted us to think so," she said softly, her mind racing. A staged theft would explain the unbroken order of the shop, the careful placement of the dagger. She thought of a burglary in a neighboring village, where a broken window had masked a family member's theft. The sapphire's absence was too neat, too deliberate. Determined to trace the dagger's origin, Miss Marple asked Hurst to accompany her to Mr. Grayson, Vale's supplier, who lived on the edge of the village. Grayson was a wiry man in his 60s, with a craftsman's hands and a shop filled with the tools and materials of the jewelry trade. He greeted them with a somber nod, his eyes reflecting the village's shared grief. "Miss Marple, constable," he said, setting aside a loupe. "A bad business, Gideon's death. He was a fine jeweler, one of the best." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but purposeful. "We're trying to understand more about a particular item, the dagger found in Mr. Vale's chest. It was an ornate piece, with a mother-of-pearl handle. Did he ever show it to you, or mention where it came from?" Grayson's brow furrowed, and he nodded slowly. "I know the one. It was part of a set he bought at an estate sale in London, about a year ago. 3 daggers, decorative, not practical, more for display than use. He kept them in that locked drawer of his, showed them to me once, said they were a curiosity, not for sale. I told him they were too fine for a workshop, but Gideon liked his oddities." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. 3 daggers, you say? And they were kept locked in his drawer?" "That's right," Grayson said. "He was particular about that drawer, kept the key on him, never let anyone near it, not even Thomas. I saw him lock it myself when I visited last month." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing as they returned to the shop. The dagger's origin was confirmed a collector's piece, not a tool, taken from a locked drawer. This ruled out a random thief, for only someone with access to Vale's key or knowledge of his habits could have retrieved it. She asked Hurst to search the shop again, to ensure no other daggers remained, but the drawer held only the items she had seen. The other 2 daggers, if they existed, were gone or hidden. Back at the shop, Miss Marple stood by the workbench, her thoughts weaving the new information into the pattern. Thomas might have known of the drawer's contents, watching Vale daily. Margaret, living above the shop, would have even greater access. Crane, a frequent visitor, could have glimpsed the key's hiding place during his visits. Holt, though outside, had sawdust on his boots, suggesting he had entered at some point. Each suspect had opportunity, but the dagger pointed to intimacy, a knowledge of Vale's private habits. She turned to Hurst, who was watching her with growing admiration. "Constable, I think we should search the suspects' homes, if you can arrange it. The other daggers, if they exist, might tell us more. And the sapphire, it's possible it's closer than we think." Hurst nodded, jotting in his notebook. "I'll get the sergeant to organize it, Miss Marple. You've a way of seeing things I'd never have thought of." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already turning to the next step. The dagger's origin had narrowed the field, but the sapphire's absence and the staged breakage of the case suggested a deeper plan. She thought of a theft in her youth, where a family heirloom had been hidden to divert suspicion. The truth, she knew, was like a gem in the rough and polished, but waiting for the right cut to reveal its brilliance. She would find that cut, in time.